You're listening to the Safe Tea podcast, hosted by Nikki Brown-John, where we talk all things safeguarding over a cup of tea.
Welcome everybody to Safe Tea podcast. I'm Nikki Brown-John. I'm the independent chair for the Brent Safeguarding Adults Board. And today we are going to talk about cuckooing, and I'm going to ask Andy and Gary to introduce themselves. So Andy.
Thanks for having me. I'm Andy Cameron, attached to Project Adder. I'm based down in the south area, but have responsibility for the southwest as well, so 7 of London boroughs, and currently leading Operation Pantera, which is the MOPAC-funded pilot around cuckooing.
Thank you. And Gary.
Hi, my name is Gary Jacobs. I'm a sergeant for Project Adder. I'm working for Metropolitan Police. My boroughs are Barnet, Brent and Harrow, but I've been involved in cuckooing on Brent for the past 18 months, so I'm well versed to the issues we're talking about today.
Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, can you explain cuckooing in simple terms to someone who's never heard of it before?
So I always describe cuckooing in its most simplest form as a 24/7 burglary. The one place where any individual should feel safe is their home, and somebody who exploits somebody through cuckooing, invades that privacy, takes over their property, is simply, in my opinion, replicating a 24/7 burglary.
That's really helpful, and I think the government guidance that's out is already talking about that home takeover. So the way you've just described that just 24-hour burglary sort of taking over someone's home.
Pure home invasion, I would describe it as, where the one place people should feel safe in London and anywhere, to be honest, is in their home. And then obviously you have perpetrators coming in, taking over, exploiting them for their own gains.
Thank you. And how does it differ from other forms of exploitation, such as county lines activity? Because we hear a lot about that involving children. So is there any difference?
There's a massive overlay with county. So, for example, a property could be taken over by a gang, which would then be operating their county or their line. Which doesn't necessarily have to be a county line, it could be a local line as well, their line out of that address. However, the differences are, for me, is that there's many forms of cuckooing. You've got people who financially exploit people in cuckooing. So they could be there to take finances off people, work their way into the property, exploit them financially. You could have peer-to-peer. So you could have service users who are both suffering from addiction, initially allowed into the property, take their drugs together, and then all of a sudden, one of the vulnerable people is exploiting another vulnerable person. So that's what's called peer-to-peer. A lot of the time it can be in relationships as well. So it could be family relationships, it could be other forms of relationships as well, siblings or like a married couple or girlfriend-boyfriend kind of relationship. And essentially what started up as a normal relationship will then become into a form of exploitation where they're controlling them constantly in the house, they're exploiting them and making them do things, etc. And then the last one is, we call it quasi-cuckooing, which is essentially somebody who initially welcomes a person into their home, allows them to stay, allows them to live there, allows them to go about their daily business with them in the property. And then when it comes to time to leave, that person doesn't leave, they take over the property, and then the exploitation begins from there.
Thank you. And that really sounds quite vast. So what are the key warning signs? Because that's inside someone's home. So from the outside, from the community or professionals working in the local community, what would be the warning signs that the person, the owner or the tenant, might be cuckooed?
There's lots of telltale signs which won't initially be quite obvious. So what could potentially start off as being seen as low-level antisocial behaviour, for example, people coming and going to an address, different times of day and night. Actually, when partners or police start developing that story, start understanding it, start looking into a bit more detail, you then start to unravel what quite often becomes cuckooing. So the vulnerable person may be more withdrawn, may not be speaking with their neighbours, they may not be going to appointments, they may be demonstrating erratic behaviour, going out different times of day and night, which wasn't something which was previously done. People who potentially don't tally up with them, if that makes sense, somebody who doesn't look like the kind of person they'd usually hang around with. So let's just say you've got a 60-year-old male in an address, really frail, and all of a sudden has a group of young 18 to 22-year-old males inside the address. It could be normal, but it's not normal in this situation we've just described. It's not their grandchildren. However, as previously mentioned, you can have family-based cuckooing as well. So stuff which is out of the ordinary, things for people to see, look out for would be drug paraphernalia, potentially smells as well, like which would sort of indicate drug use. Anything else you could think of, Gary?
But basically, I think it's a change in behaviour. So when you've got a vulnerable person that's been living somewhere, maybe with no particular issues, that are aware of the outside community, and if all of a sudden any social behaviour starts around that address and that person, that is a concerning sign, because what is brought about that change, and it could be that they're linked to a gang that's taken over that address, so that's going to impact how that address is seen by the community and by that person themselves. Somebody that's all of a sudden got loads of visitors, never had visitors before, it could be a sign that they are being cocooned and being exploited. Equally, it could be, like Andy said earlier, about young people coming to that address. We know the link between county lines and how they use our young people to deal drugs, and they look to exploit young people as well. So if you've got young people attending an address that's at risk of cuckooing, that is probably a clear indicator that something's going on that we need to be aware of as professionals. So somebody that's been isolated from the family, so somebody that's been in contact with family quite consistently before, and all of a sudden the contact stopped. Why is that contact stopped? Are they being allowed to access the family like what they were before? Are visitors to the address being turned away, not being allowed to come to the address because there's been a change of behaviour for that person? There's not one sign to look out for. There's going to be lots of different signs. And as we discussed, not one case of cocoon is the same. They are all different. They are some different indicators. And as professionals, it's kind of thinking what the indicators are coming in and to say, making a decision if that is cocoon or not. Could be vehicles coming to the address. It could be bikes coming to the address. It could be a change of behaviour. It could be that person's got some injuries, maybe that they're unexplained, that haven't happened before. It could be changing their emotional well-being. It could be all sorts of things, in all honesty. And if you put those things together, you can kind of work out what's going to get addressed. And I think what's important is it doesn't matter if it's that low level ASB. And if they think it's just drug use associated with an address or a vulnerable person, we as a police and local authorities need to know what's going on, because we might have more information we know about that address and that person to realise that that person's been exploited and being cocooned.
Thank you both. You spoke, Gary, there about sort of how the police and local authorities need to put that information together and need to know about it. But for me, there's something much earlier than the police getting involved. It is about the local community, those neighbours really picking up. There's something different about that person. There's something different going on in that property that hasn't been before. So really looking after ourselves, looking after our local community. And then for some of the other services, such as community health workers or voluntary services that might be working in that area, that if they're noticing that there's that change in behaviour, or haven't seen that gentleman or that lady, or when they've totally changed the demeanour. So it's really thinking about that, isn't it? For those professionals who are working in that area, if they hear about those things, being able to understand that and take that forward so that the police and local authorities can be informed about it. You know, Gary, you mentioned sort of vulnerable people, but who do you think is most at risk of being targeted and why?
So there's lots, and I think social isolation is key with all the groups we're talking about. So cases in general we've seen on Brent, and I'm sure it's replicated throughout London and elsewhere, is that gangs that are looking to exploit people's premises and that vulnerable person for cocooning will target people that are lonely. This could be because they're isolated, it could be because they're older in age, it could be isolation through disabilities and lots of different things. But then one of the things that is really clear with cocooning is the link between exploiters and cuckoo victims is people with drug and alcohol dependencies, people that are linked to drug dealers who will then know about somebody's addiction and they've got an address that they could potentially look to exploit and deal drugs from. We also have seen cases, concerningly, where people with learning disabilities have been exploited, and they're looking for people with any sort of disability, physical as well, or a mental illness, or any cognitive impairments. So there's lots of different groups I mentioned there. But I think the key is they are looking for vulnerable people. They're looking for an address. Generally, the most common type of cocooning is in relation to drug dealing. And if you think about in the community who's more vulnerable to exploitation, that's who's going to be the target for them. They're not going to go and target somebody that's got a job, that's going to work. Those people have got no interest because that's not going to get them into property. They're looking for people with those vulnerabilities, maybe some loneliness. The tactics that the gangs use to exploit premises and people is become really friendly with them. And once they make friends with people, that person that maybe experienced some social isolation and loneliness thinks that friendliness is genuine. And as the case develops, from what they perceive as genuine friendliness turns into complete exploitation. So they know that the groups that are more susceptible to exploitation.
I'm quite into the data around this, and I think data's key to ensure that we're supporting people, the right people in the right places. The data is showing if you're a male aged 50 to 59, you are more likely to be exploited through cuckooing. It also explains if I've looked at the data from down in the south, so not necessarily Brent, but it's probably replicated quite the same. That those people come to our attention for being victims of cuckooing, in 20% of cases have more than one marker against their name on police records. So by a marker, I'm talking whether they've got a drugs marker, a mental health marker, a violence marker, or something like that. So it's people who have come to attention before. The thing which stands out most to me in terms of trends is that they are often repeat victims. 53% of cases down in the south in the last quarter of last year was showing repeat victims coming to notice, or more often than not. So yeah, that's quite important, I think. The age and the vulnerabilities associated with people.
Thank you. And so really, I think that's the data is really, really interesting. And thinking about, so often we see some of the issues that go on in society, and we talk a lot about sort of women as victims, don't we? So this seems to be one where it is actually men more, and a particular age group which we don't probably usually focus on. But there's those people who are possibly invisible in society. So Andy, you said that they might have markers against them on the police database, but they're possibly in the community, they might be seen a little bit, but actually to services they might be totally invisible. And thinking about again, not in Brent, but in work I've done elsewhere in the country, that it seems to be those signs around those who have been using drugs and alcohol. So then, therefore, as how sometimes they're perceived. And again, Gary, you said about sort of that friendship. They if they're invisible to the local community and are very isolated, that they suddenly have these people who are taking an interest in them. So they think that this is a friend. So if you go and knock on the door and raise your concerns with that individual, they'll say, no, I've invited them in. They're my friend, they're looking after me. And I do a lot of work around safeguarding adults reviews. And so that some of those issues seem to feature. They might not be the dominant feature in a safeguarding adults review, but you can see that it's starting to come in as well. So then that raises a question then about some of the services, about how they respond to that individual. If you've got someone saying, no, it's okay, they're my friend, then would that professional who's knocked on the door think, maybe I need to report this to the police? So I think it's a really sort of key learning point for it, and everybody to be just looking out for those who might not be as visible in our local communities. And also, if they're using drugs or alcohol, and maybe they're not going into the local pub, they're not getting into the local social safe environments. Thinking about how we work to protect someone who's been cuckooed, or prevent it, as Andy said, then there's the repeat victims. What do you think good multi-agency safeguarding looks like in these cases?
I think dealing with this in isolation with our own agencies, we can't deal with it in isolation. If we try to deal with this ourselves, we won't resolve the issues going on for that vulnerable person. It needs to be a multi-agency response to it, and that multi-agency response can be quite large in all honesty, and there's lots of challenges with lots of things within cuckooing, but I think if people as professionals recognise what's going on early on, it does enable the best case scenario for that person and that community around that address. To be involved in terms of multi-agency safeguarding, you need to have social workers involved, you need to have the right teams within local authorities, mental health teams, if applicable. You need to have the local policing neighbour teams involved with those multi-agency panels and response. Also, people from housing, and you can also lot third sector charities involved as well if you've got the right data sharing agreements. But there's lots of support we can give people, but where somebody's being cuckooed, if we recognise his case as being cuckooing, you cannot remove that risk where that person stays at that address. You can do some things like partial closure orders. So partial closure orders is where the police or local authority go to the local court and they can apply for a 3-month closure order for that premises, and that allows that vulnerable person or resident to live at that address and stay at that address, and anybody else that comes into that property, if this order is granted, can then be liable to arrest. So that safeguards that person at that address. Partial closures do work in some cases, and that sometimes can be enough to make the issues around that address and that person go away. But equally, where the risk is higher and you know that this individual linked to organised crime group and drug dealing, then full closure is more appropriate, and that's where you need to really work together for the partnership. Because getting a closure through the court, you need to have a lot of evidence in place from the community, from police, from local authority teams, to present that at court to get that closure. Also, the housing for that person is really key, and getting that person rehoused and safeguarded is really important. They're kind of the options we talk about at the moment in terms of safeguarding, but who needs to be involved. But the list could be much bigger than I've mentioned there.
Thank you, Gary. Andy?
For me, looking at it from a more strategic perspective, we need to have good, strong local governance in place. By governance structures, I'm talking joint governance structures with the local authority and the police. Part of my job at the moment is getting that structure replicated across London, Operation Pantera, and down in the south here as well. We've got a local governance structure where the local neighbourhood superintendent or chief inspector will oversee the area of work, Cuckooing, and there will be a joint person from each local authority who sits at the top of that person. And then we'll look down to more operational leads where we have a local inspector for each borough who will take the lead for the police in response alongside an operational person from within the local authority. It doesn't just stop there though, it then incorporates all of our partners, as Gary's already mentioned. But yeah, that strong local governance, joint working, joint governance just ensures that we are absolutely tackling it the right way, and we've got those people in authority aware and able to sort of support the work that's getting done. Gary mentioned the platforms and the forums. Them forums are absolutely key. Now, the platinum standards for me would be every borough in London has its own standalone forum for Cuckooing. And in the times where we are across local authority and policing, we have to sort of accept that we may have to have a condensed version. Now, there's lots of platforms already in place. So you may have the community Marek, ASB panels, etc. So we can utilise those forums to ensure that cases are heard, to ensure that local authorities, partners, colleagues, police officers are all having those cases put forward to be heard, which is good. But also in terms of safeguarding, what does good safeguarding look? What does joint action look like? It's about joint education and joint intervention. So by terms of joint education, what I have been asked to do and what we are doing across London is delivering tabletop exercises where we utilise a Hydra learning environment, which has been devised based on real life experiences of officers. It's then delivered to a group of people from within a borough. So we stick to boroughs, and the reason we stick to boroughs rather than BCUs is because it strengthens the network, communication between the boroughs. So you could have a cohort of people which may have somebody from the local fire brigade, someone from local housing, the local authority, the local drug service provider, a local charity, and a police officer. So you've got 5, 6 different entities all in one cohort working through these scenarios, understanding from each person's perspective and elevating that IQ across the board, which I think is incredibly important, because once that education and that knowledge is shared, when partners, colleagues are going to these addresses, that shared knowledge, that increased knowledge ensures that we're able to offer a better safeguarding service to individuals. Just as a further piece as well, joint days of action. We're delivering some days of action across some BCUs in London. Now, this will be looking at the data that we've got. So we'll be going to addresses which are currently live, so addresses we believe are being cuckooed. But we'll also be visiting addresses where, as I mentioned earlier, people have previously been cuckooed. So we go there at that intervention place, that reassurance, just to make sure people haven't returned, that they're well, that they're still engaged with their services, etc. But this isn't just the police. We've got local authorities joining. We've got local like ASB type teams as well from the respective boroughs as well. So it's a real joint approach, tackling those addresses which you've got vulnerable people in, but also potentially some nasty people in as well. Final piece as well, for me, what good safeguarding look like is early intervention and early case reviews. So I've set a policy locally here. All suspected case of cuckooing must have some form of police record created. But what that ensures is that we've got the threshold of suspect rather than believe, which means that if we suspect a case of cuckooing is coming, we will look at it. We'll take the relevant action. We'll go do a visit. We'll at least consider it. We'll look at it on its own. Is there anything further around it? We share that information in a case review. Sometimes these are urgent because we've got so much information, but sometimes they may be developed first before a case review takes place. And then naturally they'll just feed into the forums, either the standalone cooking forums or your local CMARC or ASB forums.
Thank you. That's really excellent. And as you're talking about the Hydra training, and I know for sort of many years ago, sort of being involved in Hydra sort of around child safeguarding, and it really works. So anyone who's listening who is in London, I think that borough focus, really sort of getting the multi-agency professionals around the table to really delve into and work through a case situation. I think that really does work. And then just for anybody who's not within London, the BCUs, and that's the borough command units, which is how the police are divided up across London. And then you spoke about community MARECs, or the sort of thing about sort of those high risk forums or panels, and so most areas have some form of that. And so this is part one of the podcast around cuckooing, and we'll be doing a part two later on in the summer with community safety from Brent. So I think just my final couple of questions is, you spoke about sort of how you're doing this campaign with potential victims and previous victims. Do you have any sort of thoughts about what happens to those victims or those individuals afterwards? Do they fear repercussions, or what sort of long-term support do they need?
So we can put these early interventions in, we can put a closure order, we can get orders on people, we can remove the risk, etc. But we need that real long-term problem-solving approach. And just at the point of closing down a property or removing a person from a different location, it doesn't sort of stop the overall care package, in my opinion. What I think should be happening, and is what I try to promote, is that there's a passport of care handed over. So once a person is moved to a different local authority, the local police, the local authority, the local drug service should be contacting that said location, giving them a handover so they're aware of what vulnerable person is coming onto their borough, so they're aware of it, so there can be early interventions again, so you can ensure that they're assigned to the right drug service provider so they can potentially get their script. Also, that the local police officers are aware that we've got a vulnerable person attending this location or moving to this location, and they'll be aware of the people who are potentially likely to try and exploit that person, so they can have that greater awareness. It's a long-term thing. It needs to be done. In my opinion, we could be doing it better. Absolutely. I think due to the vast majority of cases that come through across London and how every department is stretched, sometimes it's not always done. And that probably is how a lot of our victims go from being a victim to a repeat victim. We've got the new legislation coming in place as well, moving forward. Now that's had royal assent. We're now waiting for the statutory guidance. And what that will do is give us as the police more powers as well. So those powers will not just help us effectively police and safeguard people, it will help the partners as well. It will help the community. So yeah, we're just waiting for our statutory guidance on that to see how we can best utilise that new legislation.
Cuckooing victims can have complex needs because of vulnerability. I think that the challenge is supporting them going forward is important. I think when we talk about rehousing people, it's difficult with resources local authorities have got, but there needs to be consideration of where you're rehousing somebody. If you're going to put them in somewhere else where we know there's issues with, say you've got a drug user that's been cocooned and you're going to move them to another area, are you going to put them in another area that we know has got a lot of issues with drugs? These decisions are real and sometimes difficult, and there isn't the options we'd all would like. But if there's considerations that if you're going to move somebody 3 or 4 streets away and they're a drug user and they've been cocooned, that the people that cocooned them are going to find their new address. drug users talk to drug dealers, and the network and community communications there will soon get that new address, and that could end up in being repeat cuckoo victims. We need to consider where they're being rehoused if it's to save the best interest of safeguarding that person. I was going to go back over something I didn't mention earlier, and I probably think it's quite important. I think in the police, we talk about professional curiosity with cuckooing quite a lot, and a lot of investigations, professional curiosity with dealing with sudden deaths, with dealing with investigations. I think it's really important, particularly with cuckooing, because if, as professionals, we go and speak to somebody and we explain to them what cuckooing is, and they say, no, that my friends are in address and are not being taken advantage of, and we take that at face value, which is really easy to do. I think particularly in the safeguarding world, you listen to what people are saying, you take their views into consideration. Just because somebody's telling you they're not being exploited, it doesn't mean there isn't. If we are saying we've got indicators of vulnerable persons being cuckooed, then how realistic is it for that person to disclose what's happening to them? If we think as professionals that somebody is being exploited by a gang, it's really difficult for them to disclose to us, the police or local authorities, social services, what's going on with them. It's really hard, and there's so many barriers for them not telling us what's going on. So it's important that we all recognise cuckooing and what an indicators of it is, because ultimately we can make a decision if some person being cuckooed or not, but we don't know what's going on behind that door 24 hours a day, and there'll be a lot of stuff that goes on that we're never going to know. In all honesty, you're never really going to know 100% if it's cuckooing. But if we have a cuckooing joint response, you'll get the best outcome for that person, opposed to explain to somebody the concerns that we may have for them and them denying it, and we take it on face value and walk away when there's lots of indicators that they are being cuckooed and they're not going to tell us what's going on. So I'll just give you a really recent example of a case of cuckooing in Brent, and this is, I won't say it's typical, but anecdotally it is a little bit typical. So you've got an older person that's been exploited, and it often can start with like younger female drug users exploiting an older person. That's quite common in Brent, but we've had an older person that's been exploited, 2 female drug users in there. On the face of it, in this case, it quickly developed to when police noticed drug users coming to and from an address. They did a welfare visit at the address, and when they went inside the address, they found scales in the address, they found a baseball bat and knives everywhere in that address. These clearly didn't belong to him, and he had nothing to do whatsoever. He was a complete victim of it. But I think, as I said earlier, where you've got concerns, just because you've got drug users associated with address doesn't mean it's not going to lead on to that organised crime group exploiting that address. So I think that intervention at the early point is really key, because then you can stop that going on to worst case scenario.
Thank you, Gary. I think that's a perfect place to stop. And I think because the final question was going to be what key message for frontline workers. And I think you've said it there. It's if you suspect cuckooing but not sure, and the person says, no, they're my friend, don't take it on face value. Discuss it with others. And so for part 2 of the podcast, we will be talking a little bit more around those community safety measures and looking at those high risks and how we come together from a safeguarding perspective. But certainly this has been a really brilliant conversation. Thank you both so much. And certainly from a safeguarding adults perspective, in Brent, we are really focusing on those with complex needs, how we prevent harm and how we safeguard and protect as well. So I think cuckooing is going to be, going forward, a really sort of key element of that. So thank you.
Just thank you for having us. And if anyone's got any questions and stuff, feel free to link in with myself. But Gary's probably your best person as a local person for Brent.
Thank you so much. And I hope this is helpful for those listening. And do look out for part 2 of this. Thank you.